Have you been in your current role for a while and maybe you're considering a transition from being an individual contributor to a leader and you're not sure if it's right for you? Well, in today's Build episode, we're going to explore some of the trade-offs that aren't talked about. So stay tuned. Welcome to Build, brought to you by Pivotal Tracker. I'm your host, Purnima Vijay Shankar. In each episode, innovators and I debunk a number of myths and misconceptions related to building products, companies, and your career in tech. Now, one myth that I came across early in my career was the transition from being an individual contributor to a team leader. And I struggled with this transition because I worried about my skills getting rusty and whether or not I had the skill set to actually lead people. So if you're grappling with this, we're going to cover it in today's episode. And to help us out, I've invited Jeanne Sue, who is an engineering leadership coach. Thanks for joining us today, Jeanne.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you and I met a couple months ago at an event, and I'm really curious to know a little bit more about your background. So maybe you can walk us through what drew you into tech and ultimately led to what you're doing today.
Sure. So I went to school for computer science, and I actually went to a liberal arts school. And so a few years in, I started, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And what I really enjoyed was the coding and the projects and the, I didn't really know anything about what the applications were going to be or what software engineering was as a job, but I really loved the classes. And so I think that when people talk about how to attract women to tech, a lot of the conversations are actually, they don't seem as relevant to me because I really loved the actual coding itself. And I didn't know anything about what I would do after I graduate.
Yeah. So where'd you land after college?
So I had interned at Google the summer before I graduated, and then I ended up taking a full-time offer at Google that started right after I graduated. And I moved out to Mountain View, and I was there for about a year and a half, and then I quit and wanted to see what else was out there. I kind of had the sense that Mountain View and the Google campus was a little bit of a bubble. And so I started to dabble in Android development. I ended up at Pulse and did some of the Android development there. And then after that, I was there for about a year, and then I ended up at The Obvious Corporation, which later became Medium. I worked on their first prototype. And then I was there for about 5.5 years.
Oh, wow.
And then I left about 6 months ago.
Yeah. So what catapulted you to strike out on your own?
It was kind of the right time to make a big change. I mean, I don't know if it's like I have 2 kids. I have a almost 2-year-old and a 4.5-year-old. And that's very, it's not stable, but there's sort of a monotony in like taking care of them.
Sure.
And I had been at Medium for 5.5 years. So I think there was a part of me that just really wanted a really big change. And I was ready to kind of jump in the deep end again and figure something out that was completely new to me.
Now, when you were at Medium, that's when you did your transition, right? From being an engineer to an engineering manager.
That's right. Yeah.
And what kind of prompted you to even consider this transition? Because, a lot of people just think, I'm happy kind of coding away. Why rock the boat?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was pretty happy coding away, but I think I wanted to see where I could be more impactful.
Okay.
I don't know that I really chose it for myself. Like I was sort of, I wanted to have more impact and influence, and it's sometimes I was, stepping into tech lead or project lead roles, and I think at some point it was like everyone kind of knew that this was kind of the path I was headed, and I was almost the last person to know.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it was interesting because when I made that switch and started to take on a few direct reports, I think everyone was like, "Oh, it should have happened like a long time ago."
Yeah. What do you think they saw in you that maybe took you a while to see in yourself?
I don't know. I guess I didn't really know what a manager did. And even at the time at Medium, it wasn't called manager. I think they still call it a group lead. And so it was very much this like mentor, advocate, coach role, which is sort of, what I'm doing now is very similar to that. So I think it was like that people saw that in me, that they felt like they could talk to me about things and that I would help them solve their problems. And I was never very much of a like command and control top down type manager, which is maybe what I thought managers did.
Yeah, so maybe it was your perception or maybe misperception of this is what a manager is. So clearly, I'm not a manager because that's not what I want to do.
Right.
When really you've naturally been doing a lot of great tasks or I guess things that managers would do.
Right. Yeah. Like if you ask me like, oh, do I want to help people and support them and help them solve their problems? Like, yeah.
Right. But not maybe I want to enforce strict process. Or
right. Like I'm just going to tell you what to do every day.
Got it. So tell us some of your concerns then going in aside from this, I don't know if I'm capable of being a manager or what a manager role entails. What were some concerns you had?
I mean, my transition was pretty gradual, but as I got more and more in it, I definitely had this concern that it was too early to go 100% in that direction.
Why?
I mean, I think a lot of it is the tech industry. I sort of have this sense that people who don't look like me, specifically white males, if they look young and they're in a management position, people tend to give them more the benefit of the doubt and think, oh, that's someone who is like so talented that he got promoted into management. And I sort of worried the opposite would happen to me, where people would look at me and say, oh, she doesn't even have that much technical experience, or like she looks really young, looks like she came out of a boot camp or something, whereas I really had like a decade full of experience. So I definitely had that anxiety of like, how will I be perceived, once I leave this company?
Yeah. And how did you handle that perception, kind of get over it?
That's a good question. I think that a lot of it was sort of, I mean, I also had the sort of struggle of, do I then count as someone who's like non-technical anymore? Right? Because you see these statistics of like, oh, 70% of women leave their technical roles. I'm like, am I contributing to that? Right. But I think what I landed on is sort of like, the whole point is that you should be able to do what you feel like is your calling and that you want to do, right? Not that you're like, oh, I'm contributing to this statistic that we want to go up, or down, not up.
Right.
So I think that's part of how I kind of came to terms with it. And then when I was thinking about like how to, like if I was leaving the kind of the IC work too early, what my manager helped me focus on was like, what would I get out of doing more of it? Right. And he's like, well, if you want to do like a VP or head of engineering type role, I feel like you've already demonstrated that you can do that. Like, even if it's areas that you're not familiar with, you can work with engineers to figure it out. Like, you've done that before. And so what would you get out of it? Right. And I was like, oh, I guess it's sort of this feeling of like, I should do it. I should do more technical work, not that I really wanted to, or that I was drawn to do more of it.
Yeah. It's interesting that he led you down that path of what would it look like in your current role if you were to do more of maybe the same, right? Or where would that kind of take you longer term? And is that the kind of work that you want to do?
Right. And he was very open with me and saying like, okay, well, you know what? I understand that you may want to go kind of like shift back a little bit, but for this quarter, we really need you here.
Sure.
And let's reassess. So it felt very like a temporary, not temporary, but it was like an ongoing conversation. It wasn't like if I wanted to go back into IC work, I'd have to leave the company. I always had that advocate in him.
So you ultimately decided to take the choice and go from being an individual contributor in IC into a leadership. What were the first few months like in that transition?
It was kind of a long transition. I'd say it was like over maybe 2 years.
Yeah.
And so the first few months, I mean, I definitely had this sense of like, I don't have time to get my work done. Because when you're responsible for both the coding work and, being responsible for teams or people, it's really hard to have that like maker time. Like,
Context switching.
Yep. Right. So I definitely felt like it's easy to just say, oh, like I had a day full of meetings, I didn't get any work done.
Right.
I think that's a very, very common mindset to have when you make that transition.
Yeah, I think for me, when I went from being an engineer to a founder, the hardest thing was I'm no longer going to have something to point to at the end of the day. Because before I could build something, deploy it, and be like, look what I built. And at the end of the day, I was like, yeah, I talked to 5 people.
Yeah, I started keeping, in the times where I felt like the transition was the roughest, I
Mhm.
started keeping a log of like, what is the one thing that I felt was most impactful that I
Mhm.
did that day? And sometimes I kind of had to make it up. You know, I was
Yeah.
like, oh, I had a one-on-one with this engineer and maybe she thinks about herself fundamentally differently now and is now going to interact with people in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to like take those where you can get them.
Right. And it's squishy and you don't see the results immediately and it's developing a level of comfort with that. I think that's one of the harder pieces and where people get demotivated when they're not seeing their results fast enough versus with code it can be very instantaneous.
Yeah, and I think management success or being a leader is a little bit more subjective, and the feedback loop is a lot longer.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, I mean, if you're just talking about like actual feedback that you get, that's, I don't know, at companies that kind of have, can I curse on here?
Yeah, of course.
Have their shit together.
Yeah.
It's like 6 months, you know, every 6 months you get some feedback on
Yeah.
how you're doing. The official, you know, formal feedback loop.
Right.
But beyond that, you know, you have the one-on-ones, and that's a very individual relationship. And so I think for a lot of people, they don't really see the impact of their work, right? And one of the things I've been thinking about is like for the engineering work, for the most part, your impact is somewhat proportional to the work you put in.
Right.
So if you spend 2 months building a system with a team, that's 2 months that you put in. Hopefully it's like an important thing that you've done.
Right.
But in the management work, sometimes you can do, you know, some tweaking or some restaffing up front that can have really big impact that you know, people might not trace back to you.
Yeah.
And so you sort of have to see that loop, that feedback loop for yourself.
Were you ever in a situation where you also went from being an engineer with a bunch of teammates to then being their manager and having them as direct reports?
Most of my early direct reports were new grads. So in some ways that was sort of easier. Like I had just been there, you know, like 8 years ago. And so I had a very good sense of like, oh, this is kind of where you are now. And here's the type of support you need. I'd say as a tech lead, it was sometimes a little bit more difficult, especially when I was suddenly responsible for managing the work of people who were more senior than me.
Oh, yeah.
That I feel like I kind of took a very hands-off approach, which sometimes was like, there's just like, you know, miscommunication.
Right.
But it is something I feel like, especially as a manager, you have to navigate of like how it's okay to be friendly with people. I mean, obviously you want to be friendly with people in the workplace, but how much you can be like good friends, you know, like outside of work.
Yeah, and how to be authoritative.
Right. And navigating that was a little bit tricky for me. Like figuring out, you know, if someone invited me to something, should I go? And like what if I did something, who should I invite? And at some points I just like didn't hang out with people at work who were on the engineering team because it was like I felt like I had to invite like 30 people. Yeah. I don't want to invite 30 people.
Right. So you want to be careful about playing favorites and stuff like that.
Right. And I think I was especially sensitive to that because I'd seen it happen, you know, like people who are friends like go to Vegas together and then you're just like, well, I understand you're friends.
Right.
But, you know, it's hard to say that that's completely separate from their work. Right?
Yeah. And what about the boss factor? I know for myself as an older sister, bossiness is just totally normal for me. But did you have a sense of like, how do I go and be more of an authoritative figure or a disciplinarian sometimes?
Yeah, most of that kind of stuff was in one-on-ones.
Okay.
I feel like one of the areas that I kind of grew into was to bring that to a more group setting. And a lot of my feedback would be around like Jeanne has, like, we want to hear more from her.
Oh,
like people wanted to hear more from me. They knew that I was kind of like, I had an opinion, but I wasn't like voicing it. Actually, after I had figured out that I was going to leave and do my own thing, I kind of like became more uninhibited. So I was sort of just like saying whatever I wanted to say in meetings, which probably actually made me better at my job.
Right.
I'd say. Yeah.
And what do you think kind of got you to that level aside from putting in your notice? Did you have a mentor that kind of helped you see these were hurdles or things that were holding you back as you were doing the transition into a leadership role?
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of peer support, and my own manager was
Mhm.
very helpful in kind of providing that feedback on an ongoing basis.
Mhm.
And I think for me, it was also like seeing that when I spoke up in meetings, like, okay, so one of my pet peeves is like inefficient meetings. And
I agree.
and one of the things I would start to do, a few years in was like, okay, I'm just going to get up and like start to facilitate the meeting and
Mhm.
like get people on track and kind of cut people off. And that came out of a facilitation role that we had at Medium, but sometimes there's unstructured meetings. So I kind of
Right.
just take that role. And the first few times it was like, I don't know if this is okay. Like, do people think I'm being, overbearing? But once I started getting feedback of like, oh, like thank God you were there to do that,
Yeah.
or like, or people would start electing me
You're
to be
doing
the
the things they're thinking
facilitator,
of doing. Yeah.
right? And I was like, why do I just sit here with this sinking feeling of like, this meeting? Why don't I just do something about it?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So you were naturally gravitating towards taking the reins and steering people in the direction.
Yeah.
So it wasn't as if you were having one-on-ones with your boss or your manager every week and saying, I have this problem, how do I deal with it? You naturally saw opportunities and thought, I'm gonna dip my toe in and see what happens.
Yeah, I think there was probably like a long way I could have gone before, like, one of my goals actually, and I never achieved this, was like for people to for my manager to get feedback about me that I
Okay.
was like over the top, because I knew
Oh,
there was like a
good.
long way to
Yeah.
go.
I always push people for that. It's like, yeah, push to a level of aggressiveness and then you'll
Right.
know. Yeah.
Yeah, because I could tell that it was really myself holding me back, and there was like so far from where I was and where that was really like going to be a problem,
Mhm.
and so I kind of wanted to see like, what was the range there.
Yeah. Did you ever hit the
No, I didn't.
No?
I
Okay.
left before.
Something new to aspire to then.
Yeah, maybe.
So what do you think you've gotten out of the now, what is it, a year, 2 years since you've been a leader? What do you think you've gotten out of that experience that maybe you wouldn't have gotten had you stuck to your individual contributor role?
Um, I think there's equal, like, I was gonna say impact and influence,
Mhm.
but I feel like even in an IC track, there's ways to achieve
Sure.
that and to lead also.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Um,
Let's talk about the leadership first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for as a manager, I felt like it's definitely like pretty exhausting to be the person sort of like taking care of people and supporting them, but there's a lot of rewards there too, which is like, that these people have someone who, they feel safe coming to when there's issues. And I don't know, it's just like a level of influence that like what I had from my manager, just being able to extend that to everyone else. That was really that really meant a lot to me.
Yeah, and any impact on the product or the company that you can speak of?
In terms of like the company, a lot of my role was also like doing engineering operations work. So it's kind of like team-wide processes, taking what was working on my team or other teams and kind of expanding them to be part of more of the whole engineering team's processes. And then something I also saw at Medium was engineering was the largest team, and so a lot of times engineering would pilot something, and then it would work really well, and so we'd expand it to the rest of the company. So that was kind of cool too, to see that level of like, hey, like what's going on over there? They seem to be like pretty well supported.
Yeah. So then coming back to the question that you proposed, if you had stayed in your individual contributor role, how do you think it would have manifested itself?
I don't think that was ever really for me, but I think that once I could see that I was capable of doing it, that also made me much more comfortable to switch to the management track.
Yeah.
Because I really felt like for a while that I wasn't cut out to do the like hardcore infrastructure platform work and the kind of going that way as my career route. And then I did spend like a quarter or two really diving deep into platform work. And I could see the path there.
Yeah.
And so once I could see the path, and I was like, okay, I can see this. If I don't do people management and some of the other things I'm doing, and I just focus on this, like I could see how I could get to, where this person is in 5 years or 10 years. And so it was interesting because just seeing that helped me kind of be comfortable with moving to the management track more fully.
Yeah, and you mentioned there being some opportunities for leadership for individual contributors. So for folks who might in our audience choose to stay as individual contributors for the long haul of their career, what do those opportunities look like?
I mean, there's a lot of different, even in the individual contributor. I mean, some people include tech lead as part of that track.
Yeah.
I think in the more purely individual contributor track, you can still expand your influence, and you can be, the architect of larger and larger things, or just be able to coordinate. I mean, it becomes less individual, even though you're still doing the work, right?
Sure, you're just divvying it up or directing people, but
or
maybe not responsible for their career.
That's right, yeah. Or you're thinking more about the high level technical strategy of the company, or I mean, that I think eventually leads to architect or CTO type roles. Whereas once I had kind of figured out the paths, I didn't really have a sort of canonical like VP Eng to be like, oh, this is what a VP Eng does and this is what a CTO does. I had worked at Google, where you have no visibility to to those people. Pulse, which we were just all kind of like figuring things out, and then Medium, where my manager was the head of engineering, and it was very much like a hybrid VP Eng CTO role. So, but once I had figured out like what that actually meant, it was pretty clear to me that like the path that appealed to me most was sort of the VP Eng route.
Yeah, it's nice when you have a little bit more transparency.
Yeah, because otherwise it's just like I don't know, like I don't know where I'm going because I don't even know what the options are.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good final set of words for our audience, is getting a sense of what the various tracks look like before you pre-select or make the decision to not participate. It's kind of get your facts straight and get a sense of what each role is like.
Yeah, the book The Manager's Path is really good for that because she, Camille, the author, she lays out a lot of the I like how she lays it out, because at the end she talks about all the core like things that a company needs, and then the different combinations of roles that they use to achieve them. Because VP Eng and CTO can actually mean very different things depending on the company you're at.
Nice. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Thank you so much, Jeanne, for sharing all this awesome information. I know our audience out there is going to get a lot out of this. And for those of you now in the audience, Jeanne and I would like to know, have you recently done a transition, maybe from being an individual contributor to a manager or a leader? What were some of the concerns you had, and how did you go about handling that transition? Let us know in the comments below this video. That's it for today's episode of Build. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive the next episode, where we'll dive in a little bit deeper and talk about how you want to manage your concerns around your skills getting rusty when you go from being that individual contributor to a leader. Ciao for now. This episode of Build is brought to you by our sponsor, Pivotal Tracker.